football stories. Gene, come on forward. I'm going to let you introduce our guest, Pete. Also, I'm going to be passing this around. If you'd like to be on our email mailing list to receive emails about future events, upcoming things, put down your name and email and we'll get you on the list.
And I should have included also, our membership is very easy. It's just practically nothing for the dues. It's $10 for individuals and $15 for family. And so if any one of you are not members and would like to join, why, just let me know afterwards. Tonight I want to introduce, when you talk about history and football in Wabash, you have to include an icon, and that's what Pete Rish is. He's an icon, and he's done it all. He's been a coach, he's been a player. I expect maybe even we're the water boy a couple times, Pete. I don't know, but we're really happy to have you tonight. And I'll just let you. Well, first of all, when I went to talk to Pete about this, he never hesitated at all. He said, "Sure." He said, "I'd like to do that." The other thing is, he said, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "It's October. We want you to talk about football." He said, "Choose anything you want." I said, so he said, "Okay, I'll just tell some stories and stuff." So I have no idea what you're going to get tonight, folks. But we'll let Pete figure it out. Pete, good to have you.
Yes, that's pretty true what Gene said. That I said, "Well, what do you want?" And he said, "Well, you know, you've been involved in football for several years around here. Maybe you could give us something, a little background in the history of what it's been down through the years." I don't see anyone in the crowd here that's my age, so what I'm going to give you tonight and the stories, you won't know whether I'm giving you a bunch of bull or whether it's some of the actual stuff.
Wait a minute.
But I appreciate Gene's asked me to come down. I wondered at the time, wow, you know, what am I going to dig up? But in the last couple of weeks, just sitting around the house and daydreaming and going back and reminiscing, a lot of wonderful old memories popped up, and so I'm going to try to give you some of it as to what I saw as a kid growing up. And I titled it "The History of Wabash Football." And then I thought, let's have some of the history of Wabash football, because there's a carload out there that any one of you guys, and particularly Chuck back there, he could stand up here and tell you a lot about the football in Wabash. High school football in the early 1900s. And as most of you know, they were played down at the Cook Field, down where Pettit's printing shop is. And there was a guy, a junk dealer here in town, that Cook was his name. And he put that field in, and down at the south end of the field, almost to the street that runs parallel with the river, was the baseball diamonds. And he had an amphitheater. He really dressed it up professional for that time of years and so on. And down at the north end of the field was the football field. The teams, both the high school and the WAA, they used the field. And the high school, located on Hill Street across from the library, as all of you, I'm sure, remember. The teams would dress there for practice or on game day, walk down to Carroll Street and then walk all the way down to the field. I thought about that after. What do you do through the week when you practice? Do you go through the same routine, which would be quite a trip, you know, about 4 or 5 blocks all the way down there to walk to the field. But they did, and the WAA also used that field. The high school played all of their games on Saturday. I never saw a high school game. I wasn't old enough at that time when the high school was playing down there, but the WAA, and they were located up on East Main Street. I think, well, I don't know who used to be in there, but it became the community gym. And I think the WAA group funded money and built that old gymnasium there. And the high school then shifted, and they would play their basketball games at the old community gym. As I said, I never saw a high school game, but I did see 2 WAA games. My father was a member of the WAA, as a lot of the businessmen and men around town were. So I heard all of the stories that went on about the WAA and game day and so on. And like I say, the WAA, they played on Sundays. Well, when it rained, that field, and particularly at the north end, just about where, who's located there now? Maybe somebody can tell me, where the water works and all of that stuff. But anyhow, as you approach the field, no different than what it is today, up over the little rise there on Carroll Street, and make a hard left, and you went down into the field. The field had about an 8-foot wooden fence that encompassed the entire field. No bleachers. Didn't have any bleachers. The crowd would just stand around the sidelines and the end zone and so on, but there was no bleachers for anyone to sit on. When it rained, the north end of the field, in the end zone to the west, that filled up with water. And on game day, the volunteers from the WAA, those guys would tear down there about 10 o'clock in the morning with buckets to bail out the end zone so they could play. Well, I can remember the story that my father told as if it were yesterday. Wabash was playing Fort Wayne, and they had a ball club. And they played 4 quarters. And there was roughly 5 minutes left in the game, and the score was 0-0. Wabash drove the ball down within the 5-yard line. And they punched up in there 3 times, and they couldn't get in. There was a fellow by the name of John Bender. He worked for the Big 4 Railroad, and he was a friend of my dad and so on. Anyhow, Bender came back into the huddle, and he told Red Milner, and we'll get into Red Milner, but he told Red Milner, who was the quarterback, "Red, I'm going to run out into the water," which was about knee deep. "You throw me the pass." They came out of the huddle and they lined up, and Bender ran to the west and out into what was left that the boys had tried to bail out. Milner threw him the pass, Red caught it, and it was 6-0. The defensive back for Fort Wayne said, "No way. I ain't gonna run out in that knee-deep water." It was cold November day. He didn't want any part of that. And as the game ended, Wabash had beaten Fort Wayne 6-0. They didn't get the extra point, I guess, but that was it. I mentioned Red Milner. Who was the great uncle of Dr. Bob Mattern. Red Milner, and I was a kid growing up, and a kid, 6, 7, 8, and on up. You never ever talked football in Wabash. There's Dr. Mattern right there. You never talked football without talking about Red Milner. He was the legend of Wabash football. And for me, with all the great ones that we have, Red Milner was the ultimate. That's where you started with football players that were turned out in Wabash, Indiana. Red, as a matter of fact, he graduated from high school, and I tried to run some research on Red a couple of years ago, and he was not listed in the books, the Wabash alumni books and so on, of graduation and of all the classes. But Red graduated in 1901. And after graduation, the following year, he went back to school. I don't know, Doctor, whether you know this story or not. I kind of jumped ahead because I had called Dr. Mattern's mother, Dorothy Milner, and I asked her, "Could you give me any information on Red?" I said, "I can't find anything on when he went to high school and when he graduated and so on." I said, I've got it on your father, who was one of the leading lawyers in town for a great many years, Quincy. And she said, "Oh, let me check. Gee, I don't know." But she called me back a week later and she said, "You know, I checked everything and I can't find out as to when he graduated and so on." I said, "Okay." But anyhow, recently I did find out that Red graduated in 1901. In the fall, Red went back to school, enrolled in a math class, one class. He enrolled in the math class, and it made him eligible to play football. He played 5 years of high school football. Yeah, right. He played 5 years of high school football. The Indiana Athletic High School Association was just formed, but they didn't have any law or any rules on eligibility at that particular time, and that's how Red got under the wire. Red played, I think, 4 games of high school football that year, and that was their season at that time. When the season was over, he joined the WAA. He went and played on Sundays with the WAA group for the rest of the season. Red Milner is about my size, about 5'6" and 145 pounds. And he was just something else. From everything I've ever read about, I never saw Red play, but all of the stories that I heard as a young guy growing up, and as much interest that I had in football. Red played, supposedly, darn near every position. He played halfback, he played quarterback, he played both ends, and he even played center. For how long, I don't know, maybe during a ball game if somebody got hurt, because he was gifted. He was an athlete, he was gifted. So Red would pop in there, I'll play center, and Jimmy, you become the quarterback or whatever, and the game would continue on. But along with it, Red received many injuries, suffered many injuries. He had a broken shoulder, broken nose, he had his ribs broken, and he got his jaw broken. He never wore a helmet, and of course in those days they didn't have much of a helmet. You could put on a stocking cap and it'd do you about as much good, but they didn't have any helmets, but some of them had some fashion, a little leather helmet that they'd put on, but there was no protection to it at all. But I can remember the story that my father told, that on this given Sunday, Red got his jaw broken. What are we going to do next week? God, we got to have Red. He's our man. They went to the blacksmith shop, which is located down where Brown's Trucking Company, where their office complex is on Cass Street, low down. But where the old building, and that's where the blacksmith was located. Some of the fellows went down to see the blacksmith and talked to him as to what they wanted and said, can you weld up and fashion some type of a face mask that we could make a helmet and so on and get Red back into the game? He did. Red put it on and played the following Sunday with a broken jaw. That's something else. That's something else. Another story along with that, and I'm jumping around now, so forgive me on that. You're going to find out what I'm giving you just kind of flows along up and down. There's no definite pattern, but Red and Quincy's father, perhaps Dr. Matter knows, their father was a judge here and quite elderly, I guess, at that particular time. And on this given Sunday, he thought that the visiting team was roughing up Red a little on the sideline. They were giving him too much. And he got very upset about it. And with his cane, he got out on the field after the visiting team, and some of the guys along the sideline had to get out and get the judge and get him back in. But as I say, Red Milliner was the legend of football in Wabash. Along with that, we have had so many, and I'm sure a lot of you fellows and Dr. Matter and Chuck and so on can remember some of the names, but we have had some great football players down through the years. And back in the 20s and in the 30s and the 40s, all the way to Wabash was known as a football town. And they used to play all of the top schools. They weren't any bigger enrollment-wise perhaps than they are now, maybe not as big. Gary Emerson, Manual of Indianapolis, Marion and Kokomo and Fort Wayne, that was their schedules. And they'd win them. they were a powerhouse. This little town up in Wabash was a powerhouse. And I can remember, again, as a kid, that I had heard, and I think my father had mentioned something, but the story was that Wabash High School had turned out more top football players that never went to college. And a lot of that is understandable because the folks didn't have the dough to send them to college. There were no scholarships at that particular time. So they moved on into the WAA, and the WAA continued down through the years as the pro team here in the community. But like I say, all of the great football players that this community has had, George Ross, I'm sure a lot of you remember that name. Maybe you knew, maybe you didn't. But George, in his latter years and following the war and blah, 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 he worked for the state highway. But George Ross was a running back, played for Billy Tom. When Tom went to Indiana University, and I'll get back to that, but then when George graduated, George went to Indiana and followed him down there to play football and to wrestle. But also, George was an all-state halfback, but he was also a state champion wrestler. He came home from the state meet his senior year, and there were 2 or 3 other boys at that time also had won their match, but nevertheless, he came home, and his brother, older brother, Lois, who worked for the city for many, many years, and he was a few years older than George, and he said, "How'd you do?" And George reached his pocket, he said, "I'm the champion." And the story is, and that was backed up by Lois' niece, I think, a few years ago. Lloyd grabbed him and slammed him on the floor, quicker than you could say scat, and said, "There you are, champion," and gave him the old one too. Anyhow, the bottom line on that was, George always said at that time and later on, there was only one guy in this town that could whip my hind end. And he said, "That's my brother Lloyd." Yeah. He was the guy that could whip me. Along with George, Clint Ostheimer. Bless his heart. Clint was an all-state end. He was an all-state wrestling champion. And I think many of you may have remembered Captain Ostheimer got shot and killed back in the 40s as a police officer for Wabash from a young man out of Marion that they had tried to capture for a couple of weeks. He had been in town and peeking in windows and so on. I think they nicknamed him the Shadow or something like that. But they finally caught him this one night. Zeno Malott, the other police officer, and Clint, they caught him, chased him up the alley by Gackenheimer's drugstore and up through the neighborhood and so on. Clint got him, marched him back to the car, which was parked, as I recall, someplace near the railroad. There used to be a bakery up there called Case's Bakery. None of you would know that. That's where Larry, the lawyer here in town, has his offices right there on Wabash Street across from the courthouse. Anyhow, they loaded the guy in the car and in the back seat, and Clint got in with him, of course. In the meantime, he'd frisked him, giving the old one pat down and so on. Didn't find anything, but he had a gun tucked in his belt. They got into the back seat of the car and started down the hill past Gackenheimer. He pulled the gun out and turned and shot Clint there. Malott pulled the car over right away, knowing what had gone on, and he heard that, and Clint, I assume, hollered, "I've been shot," and so on. This guy jumped out of the car on the left-hand side. Clint opened the door and staggered and fell on the tree lawn and died. Zeno ran across the street, and the police station was located at that time right across the street from Sheriff's Grocery and so on. And then Zeno took off, chasing the guy, and finally caught him. But that's a long story on Clint Alzheimer, who was a great football player and a wrestler. Excuse me, I gotta lay off that stuff. Bob Jones, who? Bob Jellybean Jones. He played for Dutch Struck, whom you don't know. He also played for Billy Tom. And his nickname was Jellybean, and I can only assume because when he was a kid, he was a little chunky kid, because he was a horse. He was a big boy in high school, and when he went to IU. But Bob was an all-state tackle, and he was a heavyweight champion state wrestler. And he played for Dutch Struck, then he wound up finishing with Coach Tom. When Coach Tom left, and I'll get to Coach Tom later, but when Coach Tom left and went to Indiana University as the head wrestling coach and the assistant football coach, and when Bob graduated, Coach Tom invited him and brought him to Indiana University. Bob was a Big Ten heavyweight champion wrestler, played guard on the football team. In 1935, when he graduated, the Chicago Tribune was sponsoring a football game at Soldiers Field between one of the pro teams, NFL, and the All-Americans, or the All-Stars. The All-Stars would gather and practice for a week or 10 days, then they would meet for the game. Bob Jones, one of our all-time great high school ball players that I'm speaking of, Bob was selected as a member of the 1935 All-Stars, or All-Americans. Following that, they weren't drafted, as I recall, at that particular time as they are today, but Bob signed with the Green Bay Packers. And he played 2 years with the Green Bay Packers. And they didn't make any money at that time at all. I'm going to jump back now and give you another little byplay at that. In 35, Chicago University had an All-American running back. And I wish you hadn't asked me his name because it slipped me right now. Jay Berwanger. His name was Jay Berwanger. And he was the O.J. Simpson at that time. Not a black boy, he was a white boy, but he was the O.J. Simpson. George Halas of the Chicago Bears wanted him to play. And supposedly the story was that he said, I'll take $1,000 a game, $10,000 to play the season. And George supposedly said, you gotta be kidding. I can't pay that kind of money. And Berwanger supposedly said, either $1,000 a game or I don't play any pro football. And he did not play any pro football. He didn't play any. He said, no way. Bob Jones went on up and played at Green Bay for 2 years. And here again, not making any money. So there was a job open at Central and South Bend. Bob's father, a friend of my dad, but told him one day when they were talking that Bob had come home for a visit. And he was trying to decide whether or not to accept the job at South Bend Central that he had applied for and talked to them up there, or go back to Green Bay and play another year. And between him, his father and himself, and I'm sure his dad must have said, oh, you know, and supposedly, as I understand, the money was about the same. He could make as much at the school that he was making up there, but as soon as the season was over, he had to find himself a job. So they both agreed that, no way, I'm going to take the Central of South Bend's job. Bob Jones, Jelly Bean, he turned out, I cannot tell you because I really don't know, but he turned out championship football and state wrestling teams out of Central of South Bend. And they were known for that. He was very successful as a coach, very successful. The Bowlby brothers. Who? The Bowlbys.
Oh, yeah.
Sam, their father, was a character. They came from Muscatine, Iowa, and Sam was the manager of the button factory, right where the office of the bank.
Beacon.
Beacon,
Beacon.
right there. Shorty Miser, somebody may remember, back in the 40s, Shorty Miser had his welding and metal shop in there, but long story long. So I've lost track. I jumped to, what was I talking about?
Bowlby's.
Bowlby's, yes, I'm sorry. So they moved here. They had 6 boys, not all of them, but they had several of the children afterward. 6 boys and 5 girls left. All 6 of those boys were football players. I mean, football players. They were big anyhow. The boys were 6 feet and up. I think Damon was the biggest at 6'5". He went to Purdue, long story. But they were not only outstanding football players, they were all honor students. They were all honor students. And the high school established the Gridiron Award for the athlete for the highest grade average and so on. Uncle Ralph was the oldest. He got it. He was the captain of the 1922 team. Now here again, I jumped ahead too far. Going back to the brothers, 6 of them. For 20 years, there was a Bowlby on the high school football team, the Wabash High School football team. Ralph, the oldest, 1922 was the captain. Then Byrne, and then Don, who was an all-state center and won the academic award, the Gridiron Award. And then Sam, and I'll get to him later, and also played center, but he wasn't as big. He was about 5'11". He wasn't as big as the other boys. And Damon was 6'5" and about 175 pounds at that time, all-state center, the first boy out of Wabash in 1937, the first boy to receive a scholarship to Purdue. Red Mackey Arena at Purdue University, down at the basketball, Mackey Arena. Red was assistant football and head basketball coach, but he came up to Wabash, and the Bowleys lived on Ferris Street, and he spent the day with Damon, and Damon went to Purdue football. And Paul was a center. Damon also won the Gridiron Award, Don the Gridiron Award, and Uncle Ralph. 3 of them. Bernard did not, he played in for the high school, honor student, but he didn't get the Gridiron Award and so on. Paul became a teacher later on. He was an all-conference center for the high school. But that was a great group of football players, the Bowleys. And like I say, for 20 years, they were a member of the high school team. The Yarnell twins. The Yarnell twins, I'm sure you've all heard of that at some time. They lived on the corner of Falls Avenue and Sinclair Street, in the big white house that still sits over the hedge around it. If any of you remember the old snack shop, it was right across the street. And that's where I started my football, in the front yard of the Yarnell twins' home. Football in the front yard, pole vault and high jump in the side yard, and basketball out on the drive over the garage. So they had the whole package put together there for all the neighborhood kids and so on. But they were great athletes. They were great athletes. They both received a scholarship to Purdue. Didn't stay. It was a sad situation. Edward had a bad knee that he had gotten his senior year. And he got it hurt. The freshmen were always on the hamburger squad. They played on the practice squad. Freshmen were not eligible for varsity football or basketball or anything at that time. That came later on after the war. But they were just terrific athletes in about anything but football and basketball particularly. So like I say, I knew of all of the great football talent and players that went through the system, through here. I knew all of them. And I have known all of those that have followed from 50 years on, the past 50 years and so on. So it's been a wonderful program down through the years. Turned out some great teams, mythical state championship teams in football and in wrestling. Wabash at one time was, like I say, the powerhouse of high school football and wrestling. I'm going to throw Coach Billy Tom in here along with the WAA, and then we'll get back to the high school. He was the high school coach. The WAA and the coach at the Wabash High School, well, number one, the WAA played a team out of Muncie. And Muncie had a running back by the name of Tom, that he was a graduate of Iowa, and he was an all Big Ten running back and a light heavyweight, 175-pound Big Ten champion wrestler. And he played for this outfit out of Muncie, and I knew Coach Tom. He was a meat salesman. He worked for the meat company over at Muncie and was playing football on Sunday with the team that they had. So at the Wabash High School, a coach and a young fellow named Stinger was the coach. L.H. Carpenter had been the coach ahead of him and of the 1920 teams and so on. When I was in high school, I never knew that Mr. Carpenter, our principal, had been the football coach. Hell, I thought I knew about all of them, but I never knew, and I could never associate Mr. Carpenter as a football coach. No way. But he had coached the 1920 Mythical State champions. Then following him, when he stepped down, a guy named Stinger. Stinger was the coach, and he stepped down in 1924. A group of the WAA, ex-high school ball players and so on, they said, how about this guy over at Muncie? Said, he's a graduate of Iowa, and that guy's a ball player. Why don't we go over and talk to him and see if maybe he'd be interested in coming up? Several of them went over and talked to Tom, and Tom came over and applied for the job, and he got the head coaching job for the high school at that time. Tom developed, like I say, championship football. He really, with all of the football that we had and so on, football at that time, in all fairness to the WAA and so on, was pretty much like sandlot football. It was rough, tough, and you'd walk away with a busted lip and wow, just snap the ball and everybody went. And it was physical, no question about it. When Tom took over as the head football coach at Wabash, then is when, as I can put back and think and recall and try to put things together, that's when he started putting in formations and defense and the technique of blocking and so on. He really taught football. He was a friend of my father, Coach Tom and Mrs. Tom, Ruby, were friends of my father's and mother's, and so I heard a lot of stories around about that thing and so on. But Coach Tom, and he was still a young man, 175 pounds and about 5'9", something of that. So he wasn't a big man. He'd suit up with him on practice, and he'd show him how to block, and he'd show him how to tackle, physically, knock you on the can, boy. He'd get after you. And he generated all of the team spirit and the fight and the go. And he turned out championship football. And like I started to say, to me, looking back all the way, I'm jumping now, I cannot see Mr. Carpenter, L.H., bless his soul, I cannot see Mr. Carpenter instilling that type of football knowledge into boys that he was coaching. I think it was still pretty much snap the ball to Ed and away we go. But Billy Time started the program at Wabash in 1920. I think he came in 24 and left in 27, but he started the program of teaching the boys the fundamentals of football to make you really a football player. He was here from 24 to 27, and he developed quite a reputation throughout the state of a wrestling coach and a football coach. There was a job opening at Indiana University. I don't know how but nevertheless, he applied for the job and they hired him as the head wrestling coach and assistant football. That's how Jelly Bean Jones and George Ross got down to Indiana University. He took them along with him later on. He developed, while he was there, Big Ten championship wrestling teams. In 1936, W.H. Tom, Billy Tom, was appointed the wrestling coach for the 1936 Olympic team. That's a long ways from Wabash to becoming an Olympic coach. So that, in kind of a thumbnail, is a story on Coach Billy Tom. He was a good one. He got into professional wrestling later on while he was at IU. My father brought him back to Wabash later on for a wrestling match. And of course, the entire community all knew supposedly Billy Tom. And up in the old community gym, they matched Coach Tom with Dutch Mantell. Dutch lived in St. Louis. That was his home, professional wrestler. My father contacted Tom, said, we'd like to bring you back for a wrestling match here in town at the old gym. Would you be interested? Yeah, he said, yeah, you'd come back. And my dad asked me, said, could you get someone you think that you could match up with? Yeah. The coach said, I know a fella that I'll get a hold of. Long story long, he gets a hold of Dutch out in St. Louis. He said, how about coming in 2 weeks or so for a match up at Wabash and so on and what have you. And Dutch said, sure, bet your life. I said, I'll come back. And I suppose they said, we can make a little dough on the side. So anyhow, Dutch Mantell, I can remember this story. Dutch, he gets on the train to St. Louis and he comes to Indianapolis. the coach drives to Indianapolis and picks Dutch up. They drive to Wabash that afternoon. When they get hit downtown someplace, the coach lets Dutch out. Dutch walks up to the Indiana hotel and checks in. The coach drives around the block a couple times and so on, and then he goes to the hotel and he checks in too. Different rooms, of course, so they don't know one another. They don't know one another. It just happened that they had rooms there. The following night or so on, they had the match up in the old community gym. Over 100,000 people were there, all of Wabash. But the place was packed with all of Tom's fans and Doc Whistler. Dr. Whistler was the referee for the match. Tom wore red tights, Indiana, and a red sweatshirt across here. Tom was also a handsome polecat. He was a nice looking little guy. I don't think he was. Anyhow, with that Indiana outfit on, Dutch Mantell came up. He looked like a rag bag. You know, nothing very classy about Dutch, as I was told. Anyhow, 2 out of 3, the best 2 out of 3 was the match. Tom won the first one. Dutch won the second one. And in between, they'd go downstairs, you know, and cool down a little bit, and then come back up. And they came back up for the final match. Tom beat him, naturally. They had the whole thing programmed, you know, but they did it so well, you know. Just, you know. And that's the way our professional wrestling is now, you know, my. But here were two guys, like I say, they met in Indianapolis, they drive up together, they have the match, and they put on a whale of a show. The folks in the crowd, you know, all the locals, hell, they didn't know that they came up together in Indianapolis. They just assumed that, boy, I'm telling you. And Mantell, also defense attorney, he was kind of dirty. And the crowd would get into the hooting and holler, you know, you dirty so-and-so, and so on. And Tom, of course, being an Indiana man, he was all good. But Mantell was dirty. He'd pull some dirty tricks now and then. And the crowd would hoot and holler and so on. But when it boiled down to the tail end, right at the tail end, Tom, he grabs him and slams him, and Tom's the winner, and the crowd goes nuts, and everybody's happy. But that was Billy Tom. Like I say, he and Mrs. Tom, they were friends of my family and my father and so on. On homecoming day, my parents used to drive to Indiana and stay all night at their home. So a lot of the stories that I've heard came from my dad and from the Toms and so on. Okay, that is pretty much what I had in mind on the WAA in the early years of football. Now let me tell you about me when I played. When I was a kid growing up, just a kid, and I knew all about all of these guys that I'd mentioned that I had heard about and so on. I was a football nut. I just loved it. and up to the Yarnells and in the yard, and we played, and I just loved it. So as it moved on, when I got into the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I'd go to the high school right after school. As soon as I got out of school, I'd make a beeline for the high school and stand around in the back of the team and listen to Coach Struck, Dutch Struck. Dutch was pretty much the Woody Hayes type coach. He was a grabber, a kicker, a screamer, but 5 minutes later he could have you tackle that passenger train that was coming through there. A guy that you loved to hate. He was that type of a guy. So anyhow, I would stand around behind and listen to Coach Struck as he coached and instructed the boys on blocking and tackling and do this and do that and so on. And they had spring practice at that time. They had spring practice, which they don't have anymore in high school, but at that time they did. 2 weeks, 10 days. So I was in the 8th grade, and I asked Dutch. We never, or no one ever called him Coach. It was just Dutch. That's who he was, Dutch Struck. Came out of the coal mining district down in, just across the state line into Illinois. I'll get back to that later. Anyhow, and I found out later when he went to DePaul and graduated, he was an honors student. I never knew that until only just a couple of years ago. But anyhow, I was in the 8th grade, it was in the spring, and I went to the coach and I said, Dutch, could I come out for spring football? You know, be a freshman next year. And I was in the 8th grade. Yeah, he said, yeah, come on out, you can come out. So I did. And the first week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I just kind of stood around with the rest of the guys that weren't getting in. The Yarnell twins were the only two coming back off the 1935 championship team. Sam Slimmer, your Uncle Bill Milliner, Dick Logan. You don't know these guys, but they were all top football players. All three of them, Hall of Fame at Manchester College, and they're Hall of Fame over there. But I would stand around in the background and listen to Coach Struck instruct your tackling and your blocking, and he'd be screaming and hollering and at the players and so on. And that was through the 6th, 7th grade when I was going out there all the time. So I thought I know basically what he's been saying all this time. I know how to tackle, I know how to block. Hell, I've heard it for the last 2 or 3 years coming out here and standing around. And I'm jumping now. One given day when I was out there playing, it had rained before and there was mud, a lot of mud and soft ground and so on. And some of the guys that weren't doing it, they got to picking up mud, making little snow, and throwing mud balls. I reached down and I picked up some mud, I rolled it, and I flipped it, and I don't just remember, but I'm going to say I think it hit the coach. Really, I think, because he turned around and first, I don't know how, but anyhow, so I can only remember that he turned and said, "Who did that?" And I said, I did, Coach. And I went out for football, and I think I might have been in the 7th grade. I said, I did. He said, okay, you get for home right now. And I did, broke my heart. I went back the next day to practice, and as soon as he came out, I went to him and I told him, hey, I was sorry, I won't ever do that again. That's all right, I said, that's okay. And that was the end of that chain. But on our first week of practice, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I just kind of stood around with the rest of the guys that weren't getting in there. The twins were seniors coming back. Ed, and they were both selected all-state. Ed was first team and Richard was second team fullback. Ed was the first team halfback. And the fact that they'd be coming back for their senior year, they were juniors, Ed decided he was going to go out for track. I won't spring football, I'm not going to come out for spring football. And Richard said, hello there. Richard said he would like to go out for tennis. So the point I make, there were two spots, the fullback and the running back, tailback, that Dutch had to find a replacement during spring practice. So he gave a couple of guys through Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday a shot at the running back spot. On Thursday, I suppose there might have been 5 minutes left in practice time. And he said, Pete, jump in there at the tailback spot. I had quickness, some speed, and so on. And he called the plays. It was a sweep to the outside and so on. I just danced right out there and so on. Long story long, I had a pretty good 10 minutes show. I was pleased with what I did. When we came back out Thursday night, he said, Pete, you get in there. Thursday and Friday, the rest of the week, I was in Ed's spot, the #1 tailback during spring practice. And all of next week, I was the #1 tailback for the practice and for the rest of the week. Okay. Now, that fall, school started. Our opening game was with Kokomo. We only had the 2 Yarnell twins back off of the championship team, and they beat Kokomo. Kokomo had a good bunch, had a good team. But all we had was the 2 twins. We put our suits together, packed our gear, and so on, got on the bus, and away we went. I knew I was going to get to play. I knew it. Because during practice I'd fill in and so on, but I knew I was going to get to play. I was also alternating with John Fitzpatrick, who was the wing back, the blocking back, the full back, the tailback, and the wing back. He set a yard back and just a yard outside of the end. Basically as a blocker, or you could flip a pass to him or so on. But John Fitzpatrick and I alternated at that spot. I also alternated with Ed Yarnell. I had to know the plays at both positions and so on. So I knew I was going to get in that ball game down at Kokomo. I knew that, there was no question. And I was so excited. We got to Kokomo, into the gym, unpacked our gear. Doc, I had left my shoulder pads at home. I didn't have any shoulder pads. How in the world? It's the biggest piece of equipment you got, Pete. All wound up and excited, I suppose. I had my helmet, hip pads, pants, shoes, no shoulder pads. I got a lecture from Dutch. Okay. He turned to one of the boys, good-sized kid, and he wasn't going to get into the game. We were quite sure of that he wasn't going to play. He said, "You give Pete your shoulder pads." He did. I put them on. I looked like a fire plug, I'll tell you. No bigger than one. I was embarrassed. We took the field and warmed up. It's difficult to warm up for a game and try to hide at the same time. I was, and people in the crowd, and I'll get to that later. You know, what's that Rish kid, what's he doing? Take a look at that kid out there. Well, anyhow, long story long, game started and played through the first half. No, I didn't get in, and I'm sure he probably could have put me in and out with those pads. So I'm jumping back now. Ed Yarnell, that I was playing behind, he had cut his head on the back of his head as he went to get in the car, into the back seat of the car, and I think it was downtown, and you wouldn't know where, but that's when we used to have the double steps in the old sidewalks downtown. Well, as he went to get in the car, he struck his head on the top of the door, and he peeled all of the hide off the back. Okay. So at halftime we went down, and when the start of the second half, the team came back up. I didn't go down at the halftime, or none of the other second unit, or the scrubs, if you will. They didn't go down. Everybody goes down now. When the team goes at halftime, the entire team goes into the dressing room to listen to what the coach has got to say. But the scrubs, we stayed out on the field, threw the ball around, and ripped and jumped and so on, while the starting unit went down and he talked to them and instructed them and so on. When they came back up, the start of the second half, Ed had not come up yet. So, running out of time, Dutch came to me and said, "Go in and report for Ed." He hadn't come up. We thought, well, maybe this spot on his head was hurting or something, but he didn't come up. Boy, I put my helmet on and I tore out there even with those big pads. And just as I got to the official and took a breath, they all started hollering along the sideline. Here came Ed trotting out of the dressing room and running down the sideline, so there he was. Okay, I didn't get in the game. That's our first game, understand, Kokomo, our first game. I didn't get in, all right. So, as the game proceeded and so on, I think in the third quarter, Ed broke through from about 15 yards out, and he scored. Kicked the point, 7-0. The game moved on. I didn't get in. And finally, I would dare say with maybe 5-6 minutes in the fourth quarter, a wooden fence all the way around the field, the old Cats field and so on. Some of the kids set it on fire on the far side. We had a manager, little guy about my size. His name was Paul Campbell. Lived down in the east end of the big 4 railroad yards and all of that where the park is now. Paul Campbell, nice little guy. His nickname was P-Dad. P-Dad. Okay. And like I say, it was in the tail end of the fourth quarter. And that fire had broken out on the far side, but nevertheless, I was sitting down here on the bench with the rest of the guys and so on, and Dutch let out a holler, "Where's P-Dad?" Jesus, I grabbed that helmet, I jumped up and put it on, and I ran up and I said, "Right here, Dutch." And he looked, and he started laughing. And the guys on the bench, they started laughing. He patted me on the shoulder, I said, "Where's P-Dad?" I thought he said, "Where's Pete at?" You know, and I was ready, well, long story long. And you can imagine all the next week, "Where's P-Dad?" Every time one of those clowns would see me, they'd holler, "Where's P-Dad?" And I was trying to hide. Well, anyhow, after the game, and we won, by the way, we won the ball game, and we went to the restaurant there in town. Everybody got 50 cents. That got you a hamburger, 20-cent hamburger and a Coke or whatever. But that's what we got to eat on after the game. Well, the young lady came and took our order and filled our water glasses and so on and what have you. And about 20 minutes later, she came back to fill the glasses again with water and picked mine up, and she had a pitcher and it just gushed out all over my pants and everything else, you know. So I said that was my first outing. I forget my shoulder pads. He hollers, "Where's P-Dad?" And everybody's laughing, and the gal pours water on me. That's how I remember the first game that I ever almost got in. Okay, that was the Kokomo game. The following week, we played hunting down here. And in the second quarter, Eddie Darnell, he took a shot on the knee, and he came out hurting. And Doug said, "Pete, go in." That's when I got in for the first time. Rich, the fullback, did the bulk of everything. We scooted to the outside a few times, but Richard carried the bulk of it. And in the fourth quarter, and we were up 20-6 over Huntington at that time. We drove down to around the 5-yard line, and Richard called an off tackle to the left. I was playing the tailback spot. My assignment was, when the ball was snapped to the fullback, Richard, I faked off with his tail to the right to draw the attention of the linebackers and so on. No, I said, I'm going to trick him. I'm going to block for Richie. I'm going to shoot ahead of him into the hole and see if I can't put a block on the linebacker or whoever might be there and so on. Number one, no bigger than I wasn't going to do much damage to anybody, but nevertheless, I thought that's what I'll do. I'll just shoot ahead real quick and get a block on somebody. Damon Bowlby was the center. He snapped the ball to Rich, and Rich made his first step to the left, and I shot towards the hole, trying to get ahead of him. I hit his left elbow. The ball popped out. Huntington had the ball. 5 minutes later, the game was over. I was on my way to the dressing room. I knew what was coming. Anyhow, just about where the old ticket office is out there right now, Pete, Pete, it was Dutch. And he was after me. And he caught me just beyond there. And we kept on walking. The dressing rooms were in the old high school gym out on this end. Boy, he took me apart. You're a big shot. You don't know your plays. He gave it to me almost all the way to the dressing room, and I swear he never took a breath. He just kept it going. That was enough. I was going to quit. I got dressed and I headed for home. And when I got home, I just blurted out and I started bawling. I said, boy, I was wrong. But I said, he really gave me a going over and I'm going to quit. And my dad said, well, you just settle down and you get on into bed and so on. We'll talk about it tomorrow and so on and we'll see how it goes. Long story long, everything settled down. And I went back out, of course, to practice on Monday. And Dutch was, he was okay, it was over and done with, but he peeled me pretty good. So that took care of the Huntington game. I think it was the following week, we went to Warsaw. And again, I hadn't gotten into the game, which I knew I would, and I thought, by the same token, maybe the other ball game that he gave me, the Huntington game that I got chewed out about. But anyhow, I hadn't gotten into the ball game, and there was just a couple of minutes left in the game. And we had the game won, or the Twins, you might say. We had the game won. Some of the local boys sitting in the crowd, they got to holler. Put in Pete. Put in little Pete. And I'll be darned. Dutch, he got up and he walked down here. And the boys had just scored, Ed had just scored. So we were kicking off. And he told me, you go in and hold the ball for the kickoff. Okay, I did. Ed booted it. Warsaw's star, and he was a ball player. His name was Dave Rankin. Dave Rankin. All stayed in. He went to Purdue later. He was a senior. Anyhow, Ed kicked her. And I jumped up and I took off down the field 100 miles an hour. Just going after him to who tied him. Got down to about the 20-yard line and all the traffic opened up. Dave Rankin was right at 6 feet and 180 pounds. And he had the ball, he got the ball on the kickoff. They played him deep at the goal line in the hole. He had the ball and here he came and everything parted. And Rankin and I, we were in the hole. I swear I thought the world had come to an end. Man, he hit me a ton. And I grabbed a hold of him. And we kept on going, but he ran over me and we fell down. The referee shot the gun, that which he used to do at that time, and the game was over. Here came Dutch, like a madman, just a hollering and, Pete, Pete. He pounded me on the back. That was a great tackle, he said. That was great. He said, that was great, you know. And like I said, one minute you wanted to kill him, and the next minute you were in love with him, because he was that way. Gives it to you when you need it, and then when you compliment you when you did something good. There was no way I was going to tell him I didn't tackle him, Dutch. He ran over me, and I just hung on to him. But anyhow, I got credit for the tackle, and that made it all worthwhile. So that was the Warsaw game, and we played Muncie. Nothing exciting. We got beat by Muncie, which we never could get by Muncie. I think it was more psychological than anything. We just didn't seem to be able to get past Muncie. Marion would beat Muncie, and Muncie would beat us. And then we would beat Marion. Didn't make sense. If Marion could beat Muncie, why can't we beat Muncie if we can beat you, Marion? But anyhow, that's the way it went for a couple of years. So that was the Warsaw game and so on. The last game of the season, we were playing Marion. And they had a ball club. And the young man, their star, was a young fellow named Don McFarland. A big back. He was big. He was 5'11", maybe 175, 80 pounds, which was big for high school kids at that time. We got down. I started that ball game. Johnny Fitzpatrick, who played the wingback, had gotten a knee, I think, in the Warsaw game, or whichever in between them. But he didn't start Fitzpatrick, and he told me, Pete, you started the wingback. Okay. Played the whole ball game. We got down, and the score was 0-0. And in the fourth quarter, with about 3 minutes to play, they ran Ed out of bounds at the east end of the field on the south side of the football field. They ran Eddie out of bounds at that time. They didn't have the hash mark then. The official brought the ball back in and spotted it just where your line, or the widest man, could get inside of the sideline. The widest man could just get a step inside the sideline. They didn't bring the ball into the hash mark like they do now, 15 yards. Okay. And like I say, we were down around the 30, 25-yard line, whatever. And Richard called a pass play. Eddie was the tailback and was the passer. The pass play that he called, my route was to the right and out in what they call the flat zone. Well, that took me right out on the running track that went by. That took me out of bounds, clear out on the track. I decided, here again, since I can't run my regular route, I don't have any place to go, I'll just go straight down the sideline and into the end zone. They snapped the ball. They got a good rush. Marion got a good rush. They flushed Eddie out of the pocket, and he took off running across field to the north side, trying to find someone to throw to and so on. They came through over on the other side, and he turned around, looped, and started back across the field to the south. The meantime, I ran on down into the end zone. All of the defensive backs and the people were chasing Ed, and the receivers, they all went north. I was standing in the end zone all by myself, right in the corner, all by myself. When Eddie turned and started back, I jumped up, down, and threw my arms and so on, and he saw me. And he whistled a beauty down there. Just as I caught it, McFarland caught me. I landed, he hit me, and I landed just a mile this side of the fountain. It felt like it. Not really, but he did take me for a ride, I'll tell you that. Fortunately, I hung on to the ball. 6-0. They blocked Ed's extra point. They blocked that. We lined up to kick off, and I held the ball. I had that experience of Warsaw, tearing down the field after Dave Rankin. No, I ain't gonna run down in case that McFarland gets the ball. So I didn't go down the ball, and I think McFarland did catch the ball and come out someplace around the 20. They tackled him, and the game was over. And here again came Dutch. I had caught the pass that beat Marion 6-0. And he heaped it on me. He pounded me on the back and told me it was a great catch and so on and so on. After that, down through the years and so on, when I played, things got better. I didn't get into as much trouble as I did that freshman year, but as the old saying goes, you win by experience. And you win by mistakes. I learned a hell of a lot that first year, I'll tell you. But anyhow, that was my first year of high school football. Now, I'm going to jump again just quickly. If you have to go, okay, cut her loose, go ahead. John Tatum. What a character. Doc played for him. Chuck played for him. One of the most popular coaches we ever had, and very successful. In 1947, and maybe some of you remember this or knew the story, they were playing Marion, and Marion had a ball club. Tatum told the boys, if you beat Marion, I'll walk all the way to Marion tomorrow morning on Saturday. In the second half, Wabash had to score 3 times. They were down. They had to score 3 times to win the ball game. They scored 3 times and beat Marion. The following morning, over at Choketown, Dave Walt's Grocery, there was Tatum, and I suppose 15 or 20 guys. I didn't go over, but there was a group of them over there, all of his buddies and so on. Homer T. Showalter, the mayor. Tatum had on his football pants and a jersey, and he was getting ready to take off for Marion. They all bid him goodbye. Good luck, John, you know, write us whenever you get a chance and all of that stuff. And he took off walking to Marion. Someplace along the line, I think LaFont or whatever, I think Homer T. Showalter, he drove over, and I think we had a picture of that. And he had a sandwich. He gave Tatum a sandwich someplace around the fountain and so on, what have you. In the meantime, when they all bid him goodbye, 5 or 6 of them jumped in the car and drove back town and went up to the police station. They told the officer on duty, call the Marion Police Department and tell him John Tatum is on his way to Marion, walking, and you be ready. They said, we'll take care of it. And they knew the story that Wabash had beaten Marion. Well, someplace along the line, the outskirts, you know, they must have been out there searching, but the outskirts of town, a couple of boys in the police car drove out, and they picked Tatum up and took him into the police station. They arrested Tatum and booked him for stealing the game. They put him in jail, and from there on, for a couple hours or so, they wined and dined him. They gave him everything. They had a great time together, and that was one of the highlights of Tatum's career when that ball game happened and the Marion got him. Now I'm going to close out with just a couple of things which aren't relative to football, but I don't suppose anybody here would remember any of this, but I think there was an article, Pete Jones had an article, and I think this was back in '32, the height of the Depression, and the school teachers. And the city didn't have enough money to pay the teachers. So they cut it back a month. 8 months of school. Teachers at the grade school got $800 for the year. For the 8 months. They got $800. The high school teachers got $1,000. They got $8,000, $8,000 for the 8 months teachers. Those were tough times. Bread was 9 cents a loaf. Milk, 12, 15 cents a quart, if you had 15 cents. It was tough. Down at B. Walters at the table slide, and at that time, as a kid all growing up, he never called it B. Walters, it was just a guy who worked down at the table slide. And if you don't know what they made down there at that time, in your kitchen table or your dining room table, when you had company and you pulled it open and put that extra leaf in there, they manufactured the slides that were under the table. So that was down at the table slide, that's where they were. And Boss Walters, all of these boys' father, that started the business. I think his given name was Boss Walters, and they had, I would dare say, and I'm guessing now, but probably 15 or 20 people employed. They would manufacture and ship, and they had to wait on their customers to send money back to them. Everybody was hurting bad. Boss didn't have the money on payday. He didn't have any money at the plant to pay his people. He went up to Bateman and Wolf. Some of you may have remembered the Bateman and Wolf. Of course, it was Ed Bateman and Eugene Wolf back at that time. Boss went up to see both of those boys and said, I've got to pay my help in script. And that was just, there's $10 for the week or whatever the amount was. And Bateman and Wolf had the clothing store and the dry goods on the other side, had the two of them, the groceries and so on. The people at the table slide, when they got their paycheck, it just said $9 for the week or $8 for the week, and it was only good one place in town. The boys up at the Bateman and Wolf said, yeah, we'll go along with you. Bob told them, if you can take care of my people, when things get better, I'll pick all of these up. I'll make it right with you. They said, we'll take care of it. And the people from B. Walters or the table slide, the only place they could spend their check was up at a Bateman and Wolf. Wasn't any good, and you could go over to Penny's and say, hey, I like that pair of pants. They wouldn't even talk to them. So long story long, the Bateman and Wolf, they honored the script or the paper. And little by little, as B. Walters picked up and he got money back, he would go back up to the Bateman and Wolf and he would buy back with cash X number of slips. And of course the story was that eventually he bought everything back, but Bateman and Wolf took care of him and his people during the heavy depression. And of course, I'm sure none of you here remember in the 31s, 32s, in the height of it. I did. And my parents. And we lived through that period. And I can remember one winter, my brothers and I, and we were going to school and so on. I swear we lived on pancakes. My oldest brother said it got to the place we were even walking like Aunt Jemima. That was the pancake flour. Anyhow, that was the story during the Depression of B. Walters. And now, this museum that we're sitting in today, did you know, and I'm sure none of you did, that back in 32, 3, 34, maybe 35 in there, this was a woman's garment factory. An outfit out of Chicago came down and started making ladies' dresses and so on. And they were in business here for, I suppose, 4 or 5 years until finally they folded up and so on. But this was a ladies' garment factory at that particular time. Following that, and I think now you can remember when Sears and Roebuck finally took the store. Originally, Sears and Roebuck was over on the corner of Canal and what Huntington Street, I think that comes down there, or whatever that is. And they started in the store in there. Then they took the empty store here and did a lot of remodeling and so on, and they opened the Sears and Roebuck store at that time. That pretty much wraps up, folks, what I've got to offer in the way that of those good old days back during our football and the latter years. Are there any questions? Anybody have any questions?
Pete,
Yes.
did you play with John Farr?
Did I play with,
John Farr.
did I play with him? No. John was ahead of me.
Oh, he was ahead of you.
Yes. Yes, John Farr played with Red Milner and that bunch.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, when Red Milner died, and I know he was in his 70s someplace, maybe Dr. Matter knows better than I, but John Farr, and they were close buddies and played together on the WA, he was Red's pallbearer. I knew that, I had heard that.
Well, I was working up at city service. I was 17 years old, and John would come over there and talk about his football days.
Is that right?
And I told him he couldn't play football, he wasn't big enough.
Yeah, yeah.
One day he come walking over and he had that big coat on, and he
Yeah.
reached in that coat, slapped the picture up on the counter. He said, "You think you know anybody there?" And of course I had him right away.
Yes,
But then he stood there and pointed out people and told me their names.
yes,
And Red Miller was one.
yes. I never knew Mr. Milner, only by sight. And I would run on to him once in a while on the street by Dackenheimer's or something. He'd be coming up the hill and he walked, he had a little gimp. He walked with a little limp. "Hi, Mr. Milner. Hello, hello." But I never knew, and later on I thought, I wish that I had at the time said, "Could we get together? I'd like to talk to you sometime," but I guess I was too busy doing nothing. But he was the ultimate for me of all of the great ones that we have had. And like I said, I knew them or knew of them, plus all of those that have followed. We've had some outstanding athletes in football. Right here, that's one of them. Chuck Dwyer sitting back there was an outstanding halfback in his high school days. Yeah,
He was a pretty good basketball player later on, too.
yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pete.
Thank you.
I knew Wabash had some football history, but I didn't realize it had such a rich and colorful history.
Yeah, well, and like I told my wife and one of the boys, you don't know whether I'm giving you a bunch of bull or whether that I've made up or whether some of this stuff actually happened.
We enjoy it anyway.
Yeah, right, yeah, made a good story, didn't it? Where in the hell am I going here? Can I take this off? Okay.